The metal cuffs weren't just tight, they were serrated against her skin. 17-year-old Clara wasn't screaming. She wasn't fighting. She was completely silent, watching a single drop of dark red blood slide from her wrist onto the pristine, beige carpet of the first-class cabin. 10 minutes earlier, she was just a teenager listening to a podcast. Now, she was branded a criminal, pinned against a bulkhead by a flight attendant who sneered at her like she was dirt. The crew thought they were protecting the flight. They thought they were dealing with just another disruptive passenger they could bully into submission. But they didn't check the manifest. They didn't check the last name. And they certainly didn't know that the man tracking her phone, the man currently landing his private Gulfstream on the adjacent runway, wasn't just a father. He was the man who owned the very debt this airline was drowning in. The flight crew froze when he walked in. But by then, it was too late for apologies. This is the story of how arrogance destroyed a legacy. The interaction began with a sigh. Not a quiet sigh, but the kind of theatrical, sharp exhalation meant to signal supreme annoyance. Brenda Skinner, a senior flight attendant with 20 years of tenure at Vista Airways, stood over seat 1A. She adjusted her scarf, staring down at the passenger. The passenger was Clara Jane. Clara was 17, wearing an oversized grey hoodie, faded Converse sneakers, and noise-cancelling headphones. Her curly hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she was sketching intensely on an iPad Pro. To Brenda, Clara looked like a glitch in the Matrix. Seat 1A was the owner's suite, the most expensive seat on the Dreamliner flight from Atlanta to Zurich. It was usually reserved for diplomats, tech moguls, or old money. It was not, in Brenda's experience, for teenagers in hoodies who looked like they should be in the back row of economy near the toilets. "Excuse me," Brenda said. Her voice was sugary, but the underlying tone was pure acid. Clara didn't hear her. She was deep in a playlist of lo-fi beats, shading a digital portrait. Brenda tapped Clara's shoulder, hard. Clara jumped, pulling her headphones down around her neck. Her eyes went wide. She had social anxiety. Bad. It was the reason she traveled alone so rarely. "Oh, sorry. Did I miss the meal service?" "Ticket," Brenda demanded, holding out her hand. She didn't say, "Please." She didn't smile. Clara blinked. I showed it at the gate, and the door." "I need to verify you are in the correct seat, miss. We have a full flight today, and we need to ensure our first-class amenities are reserved for our paying customers." The implication hung in the air like smoke. "You don't belong here." Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks. Several other passengers were watching. A man in 2B, wearing a tailored suit, Mr. Sterling, according to the manifest, lowered his Wall Street Journal to watch the show. Nervously, Clara fumbled for her phone. Her hands shook slightly. She unlocked it and pulled up the Vista Airways app. The QR code clearly displayed Clara Jane. Seat 1A, Priority 1, status. She held it up. Brenda snatched the phone from her hand, scrolling through the screen with an aggressive thumb. She frowned. She was looking for a flaw, a Photoshop, a glitch. "Jane," Brenda muttered. She looked at the girl, then back at the phone. "How did you acquire this ticket? Is this an employee pass? A buddy pass?" "No," Clara whispered. "My dad booked it." Brenda let out a short, derisive laugh as she handed the phone back. "Right. Daddy booked it. Look, sweetie, usually when families travel on buddy passes, they know to dress the part. We have a dress code in first class. No loungewear." I checked the website," Clara stammered, her voice trembling. "It said comfort wear is allowed on overnight international flights." "For revenue passengers," Brenda snapped, "not for non-rev upgrades." "It's a paid ticket," Clara said, her voice gaining a tiny fraction of strength. "Full fare." Brenda rolled her eyes. She leaned in, her perfume overpowering and cloying. "Don't get an attitude with me, little girl. I can have you moved to row 45 in a heartbeat. Now put that bag in the overhead bin. You're blocking the aisle." Clara looked down. Her small leather backpack was tucked neatly under the ottoman, exactly where the safety card said it could be. "But the sign says—" "I said move it," Brenda snapped, reaching down and grabbing the strap of Clara's backpack. This was the mistake. Clara reacted on instinct. She grabbed the other strap. "Please don't touch my stuff." Brenda recoiled as if she'd been electrocuted. She gasped, clutching her own chest, stepping back into the galley. The theatre of it was impressive. "Did you just grab me?" Brenda shouted. "Did you just put your hands on a flight crew member?" The cabin went silent. The air pressure seemed to drop. "No, Clara stood up, panic flooding her system. "I just grabbed my bag." "Captain!" Brenda yelled toward the cockpit, her voice shrill. "Captain Miller, we have a code red in first class. Assault!" Clara froze. She stood there, 5'4" and terrified, as the heavy cockpit door clicked open. Captain Greg Miller was a man who missed the good old days of aviation. He was tired, he was going through a divorce, and he trusted Brenda. They had flown together for 15 years. If Brenda said there was a problem, there was a problem. He stepped out, his epaulets gleaming under the cabin lights. "What is going on here?" "She grabbed me, Greg." Brenda pointed a manicured finger at Clara. "I asked her to comply with stowage regulations. She refused, became belligerent, and when I tried to assist her, she physically assaulted me. She twisted my wrist." It was a lie. A bold, verifiable lie, if anyone bothered to check the cabin cameras. But no one was checking cameras yet. "I didn't," Clara pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "She tried to take my bag. I just held on to it." Captain Miller sized Clara up. He saw the hoodie. He saw the skin color. He saw a threat. He didn't see a terrified teenager. He saw a disruption to his schedule. "Young lady," Miller boomed, using his command voice. "Gather your things. You are being deplaned." "What?" "No." Clara's breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. "My dad. I have to get to Zurich. My mom is in the hospital there. Please." "You should have thought about that before you attacked my crew," Miller said, crossing his arms. "You are violating federal aviation regulations. Interfering with a flight crew is a felony." "I didn't do anything," Clara cried out. She looked around the cabin for help. Mr. Sterling in 2B looked away, not wanting to get involved. A woman in 1D looked sympathetic but kept her mouth shut. "I'm calling the port authority," Miller said. He turned to the purser. "Call the gate. Tell them we need LEOs, law enforcement officers, on board immediately. Passenger refusal to deplane." "I'm not refusing," Clara said, shaking. "I just want my phone. I need to call my dad." "No phones," Brenda snapped, stepping forward and swiping Clara's iPhone from the armrest before Clara could grab it. "Evidence." "That's my property." Clara stepped forward. "Back off," Brenda shrieked, backing into the galley counters. "She's coming at me again." It was chaos. Clara hadn't moved more than an inch, but the narrative was being written in real time. Minutes later, the heavy thud of boots echoed on the jetbridge. 2 officers from the airport police boarded. One was Officer Higgins, a man known around the airport for being heavy-handed and short-tempered. "Who's the problem?" Higgins asked, his hand already resting on his belt. "Her," Brenda pointed at Clara. "Assaulted a flight attendant, refusing to deplane, acting erratic. We think she might be under the influence." Higgins didn't ask Clara for her side of the story. He didn't ask for witness statements. He saw a target. He marched up to Clara. "Mom, get your bag. You're coming with us." "I didn't do anything," Clara sobbed. "Please, just let me call my father. His name is Eric Jane. I don't care if your daddy is the president," Higgins barked. He grabbed Clara's arm. "Move!" Clara flinched. It was an involuntary reaction to being grabbed by a strange man. She pulled her arm back. "Resisting!" Higgins shouted. Before Clara could process what was happening, she was spun around. Her face was slammed against the bulkhead wall. The impact split her lip. She tasted copper. "Stop! You're hurting me!" "Stop fighting!" Higgins yelled, though she wasn't fighting. He wrenched her arms behind her back. He pulled a pair of zip-tie flex cuffs from his vest, the heavy-duty plastic ones used for mass arrests, but he also had metal cuffs on his belt. He opted for the metal ones, wanting to make a point. He ratcheted them tight. Too tight. Clara screamed. "It cuts! It cuts!" "That's what happens when you resist arrest," Higgins grunted. He shoved her forward. As he pushed her, the sharp edge of the metal handcuff dug into the soft skin of her wrist. It sliced deep, hitting a vein. Blood began to trickle down her hand. It dripped onto the floor. "She's bleeding!" A passenger in row 3 finally spoke up. "Hey, officer, you cut her." "Back in your seat!" Higgins yelled at the passenger. Brenda stood in the galley, arms crossed, looking triumphant. She watched as the teenage girl, head bowed, bleeding and crying, was marched toward the exit. "Trash," Brenda muttered under her breath. But as they reached the door of the plane, a commotion started at the front of the jet bridge. The gate agent was running down the ramp, looking pale as a ghost. She was waving a walkie-talkie. "Stop!" the gate agent screamed. "Captain Miller, stop! Do not take her off!" Captain Miller stepped out of the cockpit. "What is it now? We are already 20 minutes behind schedule." "You can't arrest her." The gate agent was breathless. "We just got a call from headquarters, from the CEO of Vista Airways himself." Miller frowned. "Regarding what?" "Regarding the passenger." The agent pointed at Clara, who was now trembling violently, blood dripping from her fingertips. "Headquarters says her father is Eric Jane." Miller looked confused. "Who is Eric Jane?" The gate agent looked at the captain, then at Brenda, with eyes full of terror. "Eric Jane isn't just a rich dad, Captain. He's the CEO of Apex Logistics. He owns the catering company that supplies our food. He owns the fuel contract for this airport. And his company just bought 40% of our airline's debt yesterday." The color drained from Brenda's face so fast it looked like she'd passed away standing up. "And," the gate agent whispered, "he's currently at the airport. He was tracking her phone. He saw it stop moving. He's here." As if on cue, the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps thundered down the jet bridge. Not the footsteps of police, the footsteps of a man running. A man in a bespoke Italian suit, flanked by 2 private security detail and a lawyer, burst onto the plane. He was 6'3", black, and radiated a terrifying amount of power. His eyes scanned the scene instantly. He saw Brenda. He saw the captain. Then he saw his daughter, handcuffed, pinned against the wall, bleeding. The temperature in the plane didn't just drop, it froze. The silence that befell the first-class cabin of Vista Airways, Flight 298, was not peaceful. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a vacuum before an explosion. Eric Jane didn't scream. He did not lunge. A man who manages billions of dollars in assets, who negotiates with heads of state and ruthless warlords for shipping routes, doesn't throw temper tantrums. He exerts pressure. He stood in the galley entryway, his chest heaving only slightly, the only sign of the sprint he had just made through Terminal B. His eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian, bypassed the sweating Captain Miller. They bypassed the trembling form of Brenda Skinner. They locked onto Officer Higgins's hands, specifically the hands that were currently twisting his daughter's wrists behind her back at an unnatural angle. "Release her," Eric said. His voice was terrifyingly low. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction delivered with the flat finality of a judge passing a death sentence. Officer Higgins, fueled by adrenaline and a lifetime of unchecked authority, didn't recognize the predator standing in front of him. He only saw another civilian trying to tell him how to do his job. He tightened his grip on Clara's shoulder, causing her to whimper softly. A broken, tiny sound that seemed to tear through Eric's composure like a bullet. "Back up, sir," Higgins barked, puffing out his chest. "This is an active crime scene. This individual is in custody for assaulting a flight crew member and resisting arrest. Step back or you will join her." Eric took a step forward. The air in the cabin seemed to vibrate. His two security guards, massive men in dark suits, who moved with the fluidity of trained ex-special forces, stepped up behind him. One of them, a man named Silas, simply unbuttoned his suit jacket. He didn't draw a weapon, but the threat was implicit. "I said," Eric repeated, enunciating every syllable, "take those cuffs off my daughter. Now." "And I said back off." Higgins reached for his taser. "Officer Higgins!" The gate agent, who had followed Eric on board, shrieked from the jetbridge doorway. "That is Eric Jane! Put the taser away! For God's sake, stop!" Captain Miller, finally finding his voice, stepped between the police officer and the billionaire. He held his hands up, palms facing Eric. He looked like a man trying to stop a tidal wave with a paper shield. Mr. Jane," Miller stammered, his voice cracking. "Please. There has been a misunderstanding. We followed protocol. Your daughter, she was violent. She attacked my purser. We had no choice." Eric slowly turned his gaze to Miller. He looked at the captain's epaulets, then at his name tag, and finally into his eyes. Miller felt stripped naked. "Violent?" Eric asked. He looked past Miller to Clara. Clara wasn't fighting. She wasn't violent. She was dissociating. Her head hung low, chin touching her chest. Her messy bun was coming undone, strands of curly hair covering her face. But what drew Eric's eye was the floor. The beige carpet near Clara's sneakers was stained with dark, circular spots. Drip, drip, drip. Eric's eyes followed the trajectory upward. He saw the metal handcuffs digging into the delicate, light-brown skin of Clara's wrist. The metal had bitten deep, slicing through the dermis. Blood was pulsing, slowly but steadily, from the cut, sliding over her fingers and onto the floor. The sight broke something inside Eric. The cold CEO vanished for a split second, replaced by a father's primal horror. "She's bleeding," Eric whispered. The sound was more terrifying than his anger. "You made her bleed." Brenda Skinner, pressed against the galley counters, made a small noise. She tried to shrink into the cabinetry. She had realized with dawning horror that the thug she had profiled was the daughter of the man who effectively owned her pension fund. "Unlock them," Eric said to Higgins. This time he didn't wait. He stepped into Higgins's personal space, towering over the officer. "If you do not unlock those cuffs in the next 3 seconds, I will have your badge, your pension, and your freedom. I will spend every cent of my net worth to ensure you never work a day in your life again." 1. Higgins hesitated. He looked at Eric's eyes. He saw no fear. He saw infinite resources. He looked at the security guards behind Eric. He looked at the blood on the floor. 2, Eric counted. Higgins's resolve crumbled. The bully in him recognized a bigger, more dangerous animal. He fumbled for his keys. His hands, previously so steady in their aggression, were shaking. He jammed the key into the mechanism. Click. The ratchet released. Clara didn't move her arms immediately. They fell to her sides like dead weights. Her wrists were ringed in angry purple bruises, with a deep, jagged laceration on the left one. "Clara!" Eric dropped to his knees. He didn't care about his $5,000 suit touching the airplane floor. He ignored the police, the crew, the world. He gently took her hands in his. "Baby? Clara, look at me." Clara blinked slowly. She looked up. Her eyes were glassy, filled with tears that hadn't fallen yet. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice raspy. I didn't mean to. I just wanted my sketchbook." "I know," Eric said, his voice breaking. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and gently wrapped it around her bleeding wrist. The white cloth turned crimson almost instantly. "I know, baby. I know." He pulled her into his chest. She collapsed against him, finally letting go. She sobbed, loud, heaving sobs that echoed through the silent cabin. It was the sound of pure trauma. Eric held her tight, his hand cradling the back of her head. Over her shoulder, his eyes opened. They were dry, and they were burning with a cold, nuclear fire. He looked up at Brenda Skinner. Brenda stopped breathing. "You," Eric said softly. Brenda trembled. I felt threatened." "You," Eric repeated. He slowly stood up, keeping one arm wrapped protectively around his weeping daughter. "You did this." The first-class cabin had transformed into a courtroom, a hospital, and a holding cell all at once. "Nobody leaves this plane," Eric announced. He didn't shout it. He simply stated it as a fact of physics. "Now wait a minute," Captain Miller interjected, trying to regain control of his vessel. "Mr. Jane, while I sympathize with the situation, we have a schedule to keep. We need to deplane the passenger so she can receive medical attention in the terminal, and we need to push back. We are blocking the alley." Eric turned his head slowly. "Captain, you aren't going anywhere. You aren't pushing back. You aren't taking off. This aircraft is now a crime scene." "That is preposterous," Miller scoffed, nervously adjusting his hat. "This is my ship. Under maritime and aviation law, I am the ultimate authority here." "Not anymore," a sharp voice cut in. A woman in a sharp grey blazer stepped onto the plane behind Eric's security detail. This was Eleanor Vance, Eric's chief legal counsel. She held a tablet in one hand and a phone in the other. She didn't look at the crew. She looked at the situation with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. "Captain Miller," Eleanor said, reading from her screen without looking up. "I have just filed an emergency injunction with the Federal Aviation Administration and the Port Authority. We are alleging gross negligence, assault with a deadly weapon, and civil rights violations. I have the district attorney on line 1. She held up the phone. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, stepping fully into the cabin, "this aircraft is property of Vista Airways. As of 4:01 p.m. yesterday, the primary lien holder on Vista's operational fleet is Apex Logistics. Technically, Mr. Jane can ground this plane whenever he wants, because your company is currently in default on the bridge loan he provided." She looked at Miller with a razor-thin smile. "You aren't flying, Captain. You're waiting for the FBI." The color drained from Miller's face. The reality of the corporate hierarchy had just crashed into his cockpit. Meanwhile, Eric was focused on the immediate threat. He guided Clara to sit back down in seat 1A, the seat she had been ripped from. "Silas," Eric said to his head of security, "get the medic kit. Now." Silas moved instantly, producing a trauma kit from his jacket. He knelt beside Clara, putting on latex gloves. "Miss Clara, I'm going to clean this up, okay? It's going to sting a little." Clara nodded numbly, leaning her head against her father's shoulder. Officer Higgins, who had been standing awkwardly by the door, tried to salvage his dignity. He realized he was rapidly becoming the villain in a story he couldn't control. "Look," Higgins grunted, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "I acted on the information provided by the flight crew. They declared a level 2 threat. I neutralized it. If the girl is injured, that's unfortunate, but she was resisting. Eric looked up from tending to his daughter. Resisting? He stood up again. The cabin felt too small for him. He walked over to where Brenda was standing. She was shaking so hard her teeth were audibly chattering. My daughter, Eric said, his voice terrifyingly calm, is an honor student. She plays the cello. She volunteers at the animal shelter. She has severe social anxiety. She doesn't resist. She freezes. He leaned in close to Brenda. She says you took her phone. Brenda swallowed. Her throat clicked. I secured it as evidence. Give it to me. Brenda looked at Captain Miller for help, but Miller was busy listening to Eleanor Vance list the 6 different lawsuits being drafted against him personally. Slowly, with a trembling hand, Brenda reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out the rose gold iPhone. Eric snatched it from her hand. He tapped the screen. It was locked, but the notifications were visible. 15 missed calls. Dad. Text message. Dad, I see you stopped moving. Is everything okay? Text message. Dad, Clara, why aren't you answering? Eric looked at Brenda. She was trying to call me, wasn't she? She was acting erratic, Brenda whispered, sticking to her script even as the stage burned down around her. She wouldn't comply with bag stowage. She grabbed me. Is that true? Eric asked, turning to the rest of the cabin. For the first time, he acknowledged the other passengers. Did anyone see my daughter grab this woman? Silence hung for a moment. Then, the man in 2B, Mr. Sterling, the one reading the Wall Street Journal, cleared his throat. He had been watching the entire time, calculating the odds. He realized the smart money was no longer on Vista Airways. Actually, Mr. Sterling said, his voice clear and resonant. No, she didn't. Brenda's head whipped around. Sir, you saw her, Lung. I saw you. Sterling cut her off, standing up. I saw you harass a child about her clothing. I saw you try to snatch her bag. She held on to the strap. That was it. She never touched you. You staged a flop like a soccer player. Liar! Brenda shrieked. He's lying. And then a woman in 1D spoke up, her voice shaky but determined. Then you stole her phone when she tried to show you her ticket. You bullied her. And the officer, a young man in row 3, called out, holding up his phone. The officer slammed her head into the wall. I got it on video. Officer Higgins froze. You can't record on a plane. That's illegal. It's actually not, Eleanor Vance said coolly from the doorway. And that video is now subpoenaed evidence. Please airdrop that to me immediately, sir. The walls were closing in. Brenda Skinner looked around the cabin. Every pair of eyes was looking at her with disgust. The narrative she had constructed, the dangerous, unruly thug in a hoodie, had disintegrated. Now, she was just a middle-aged bully who had tortured a child in front of witnesses. Eric turned back to Brenda. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked disappointed. You judged her, Eric said softly. You saw a hoodie and brown skin, and you decided she was trash. You decided she didn't belong in your first class. He took a step closer. Do you know why she was flying to Zurich? Brenda shook her head, tears streaming down her face now. She was going to see her mother, Eric said. My wife, who is currently at the University Hospital in Zurich, undergoing experimental treatment for stage 4 leukemia. Clara hasn't seen her in 3 months. She was terrified of flying alone, but she did it because she wanted to hold her mother's hand. A gasp went through the cabin. The woman in 1D covered her mouth. You took that from her, Eric said. You took a scared girl trying to see her dying mother, and you put her in handcuffs. Brenda sobbed, her knees giving way. She slid down the galley cabinets to the floor, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't know," she wailed. "I didn't know." "Ignorance," Eric said, turning his back on her, "is not a defense. It is an indictment." He turned to his lawyer. "Eleanor." "Yes, Mr. Jane? I want the police commissioner here. I want the CEO of Vista Airways on a video call, and I want the media." Eric looked down at Officer Higgins, who was now sweating profusely. "You wanted to make a scene, officer?" Eric said, his voice ice cold. "You wanted to show everyone how tough you are with a teenage girl?" Eric pulled out his own phone and dialed a number. "Let's make you famous." The transformation of the Dreamliner cabin from a luxury transport vehicle into a high-stakes interrogation room was complete. The air conditioning hummed with a low, mechanical drone, the only sound filling the heavy silence as they waited. Outside the porthole windows, the tarmac was a sea of flashing blue and red lights. It looked less like an airport and more like a disaster zone. Inside, Clara sat curled in seat 1A, her knees pulled to her chest. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, shaking shock. Her wrist, now heavily bandaged by Silas, throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. Every time her heart beat, she felt the cut. But the physical pain was secondary to the humiliation. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, trying to block out the memory of the passengers staring at her as she was marched down the aisle. Eric sat on the ottoman in front of her, his back to the cockpit, acting as a physical shield between his daughter and the rest of the plane. He was scrolling through the video the passenger in row 3 had airdropped. He watched it once, then twice. His jaw muscle jumped. That was the only sign of the rage that was boiling his blood. "Sir," Eleanor Vance whispered, leaning in. "Commissioner O'Malley is at the jetbridge." Eric stood up. He buttoned his jacket. "Send him in." Police Commissioner Frank O'Malley was a large man who usually commanded a room just by walking into it. But as he stepped onto the plane, ducking his head under the doorframe, he looked like a man walking to his own execution. He knew Eric Jane. He knew Eric Jane was a major donor to the Police Benevolent Association. He also knew that if Eric Jane was calling him personally, something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Eric," O'Malley said, nodding respectfully, eyes darting quickly to the crying girl, the blood-stained carpet, and then to Officer Higgins. "I got here as fast as I could. What is happening?" "Frank," Eric said. He didn't offer a handshake. "I want you to watch something." Eric held up the iPad. He pressed play. The sound from the video was tinny, but crystal clear in the silent cabin. "I don't care if your daddy is the president. Move!" "I didn't do anything!" The sound of a scuffle, the sickening thud of Clara's head hitting the bulkhead. "It cuts! It cuts!" Officer Higgins, standing by the galley door, went pale. In the heat of the moment, his memory had edited the event. He remembered a struggle. He remembered a threat. But the video showed something else. It showed a large, armed man brutalizing a terrified, shrinking child. The video ended. Eric lowered the iPad. "That," Eric said, his voice devoid of emotion, "is your officer. That is my 17-year-old daughter. She weighs 110 pounds. Commissioner O'Malley looked at Higgins. The look was not one of camaraderie. It was the look a gardener gives a weed before pulling it out. "Higgins," O'Malley growled. "Step forward." Higgins swallowed hard. He stepped away from the wall. "Commissioner, you have to understand. The flight crew stated she was a threat to aviation safety. I was following the escalation of force continuum." "Escalation of force?" O'Malley interrupted, his voice rising. "I just watched you slam a miner's face into a wall while she was standing still. I saw you apply serrated cuffs to a compliant subject." "She pulled away," Higgins argued, desperate now. She was resisting. She flinched. Eric's voice cracked like a whip, cutting through Higgins' defense. She flinched because a strange man grabbed her. That is a human survival instinct, not resistance. Eric turned to the commissioner. Frank, I am filing charges. Aggravated assault. Assault with a deadly weapon. Child endangerment. False imprisonment. And I am suing the department. Eric, let's not be hasty, O'Malley began, sweating. I am not being hasty, Eric said. I am being precise. But right now, I want him off this plane, and I want his badge. The cabin held its breath. O'Malley looked at the billionaire, then at the PR nightmare standing in a police uniform. He made the calculation instantly. Officer Higgins, O'Malley said quietly. Gun and badge. Now. Higgins's mouth fell open. Sir, you can't be serious. Over a scuffle? You drew blood on a minor in a secure environment without probable cause, O'Malley snapped. And you did it on camera. You are relieved of duty pending an internal affairs investigation. Give me the badge. With trembling hands, Higgins unclipped his holster. He placed his Glock on the galley counter. Then he unpinned the silver shield from his chest. The sound of the badge hitting the countertop, clack, was the first strike of the karma Eric had promised. Get him out of my sight, Eric said. As Higgins was escorted off the plane, stripped of his authority, he looked back at Brenda. He looked at her with pure hatred. She told me to do it, Higgins muttered. She said the girl was dangerous. Brenda shrank further into the corner. She was running out of allies. The cabin of Flight 298 had ceased to be an aircraft. It was no longer a vessel of transportation designed to ferry passengers from Atlanta to Zurich. In the span of 30 minutes, the first-class section had transformed into a high-stakes tribunal, a floating courtroom where the judge, jury, and executioner was one man, Eric Jane. The silence that followed the departure of the police was thick enough to choke on. The air-conditioning vents hissed with a monotonous, indifferent rhythm, circulating the stale air of fear that now permeated the cabin. Outside the oval portholes, the tarmac was a blur of blue and red strobes, a visual reminder of the chaos that had just occurred. But inside, the storm was entirely silent. Eric stood in the center of the galley. He did not pace. He did not fidget. He was a statue of contained nuclear energy. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, a slow, deliberate movement that drew every eye in the room. Eleanor, he said, his voice barely rising above a whisper, yet carrying to the back of the cabin. It is time to bring in the management. Eleanor Vance, his chief legal counsel, nodded. She didn't look like a lawyer in that moment. She looked like a weapon system coming online. She placed a sleek, silver laptop on the galley counter, angling the screen so that it faced the cabin, effectively turning the first-class section into a conference room. She connected to the aircraft's high-speed satellite Wi-Fi, the very service Vista Airways bragged about in their commercials, and initiated an encrypted video link. The screen flickered. A spinning wheel of death rotated for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the connection snapped into focus. The face of Jonathan Vane, the global CEO of Vista Airways, filled the screen. He was seated in a mahogany-paneled boardroom in Chicago, hundreds of miles away. The morning sun was just hitting his windows, casting a halo behind him that looked almost angelic, a stark contrast to the hellscape on his plane. He looked disheveled, his tie loosened, a half-empty cup of coffee in front of him. He had clearly been pulled out of a crisis meeting, likely regarding the plummeting stock prices that usually accompanied police activity on a tarmac. Mr. Jane, Vane's voice boomed through the laptop speakers, tinny but commanding. He leaned into his camera, trying to project authority across the digital divide. I am terribly sorry about the delay. I've been briefed by my operations center. I'm told there is a situation involving a disruptive passenger and a security protocol." Eric stared at the screen. He didn't blink. He let Vane's words hang in the air, allowing the absurdity of them to marinate. "A situation," Eric repeated. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. "Is that what they told you, Jonathan? A disruptive passenger?" "Well, yes," Vane stammered slightly, sensing the dangerous frequency of Eric's tone. "Standard protocol for non-compliant travelers. However, given your relationship with the airline, I wanted to personally ensure everything is smoothed over." "Relationship," Eric echoed. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Captain Miller, who was standing by the cockpit door, looking like a man awaiting the gallows. "Captain Miller, please come here. Say hello to your boss." Captain Miller hesitated. His legs felt like lead. He dragged himself into the frame of the webcam, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead beneath his hat. "Hello, Mr. Vane," Miller whispered. "Miller." Vane nodded, relieved to see a familiar face. "One of our senior aces. Good man. Now, Eric, surely we can—" "Jonathan, listen to me very carefully." Eric cut him off. The interruption was soft, but it stopped Vane cold. "Captain Miller here allowed his lead purser, Brenda Skinner, to racially profile my daughter. He watched as she was pinned against a bulkhead. He authorized the police to board this vessel and drag a 17-year-old girl, my daughter, off the plane based on a fabrication. He stood by and watched as she bled on his carpet." Eric stepped aside, revealing Clara. She was still curled in seat 1A, her head resting on her knees, the white bandage on her wrist stark and horrifying against her skin. Vane fell silent. On the screen, his eyes widened. He wasn't looking at a disruptive passenger. He was looking at a liability. "Mr. Jane," Vane began, his voice losing its corporate polish. I had no idea it was to that extent. Surely there is a misunderstanding. We can launch an internal review next week." "No," Eric said. "We aren't waiting for next week." Eric signaled Eleanor. She stepped into the frame, her voice crisp and clinical. "Mr. Vane, this is Eleanor Vance, General Counsel for Apex Logistics. I am referencing the liquidity agreement signed yesterday at 4 p.m. EST between Apex and Vista Airways." Vane frowned. "Why are we bringing up the bridge loan? That's a separate business vertical. That deal is closed." "Not quite," Eleanor corrected him, glancing down at her tablet. "Clause 14b, subsection C, the Moral Turpitude and Reputational Risk Clause. It states that Apex Logistics reserves the right to immediately accelerate the debt and withdraw all funding if Vista Airways or its senior agents engage in conduct that results in criminal negligence, significant public scandal, or gross violations of civil rights." Eleanor looked up, her eyes piercing the camera lens. "Assaulting the minor child of the primary lender with a deadly weapon? I'd say that triggers Clause 14b. "I am pulling the funding," Eric stated. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. "You can't!" Vane shouted, his composure shattering. He stood up in his boardroom, knocking his chair over. "Eric, that's $400 million. That capital is allocated for payroll next week. If you pull that, the credit rating agencies will downgrade us to junk status by morning. We won't just struggle, we will liquidate. You're talking about Chapter 11 bankruptcy by Friday. Then I suggest you start drafting the filing," Eric said coldly, "because I will not finance a company that brutalizes my child." "Eric, please!" Vane was pleading now, the power dynamic flipping entirely. The billionaire CEO was begging. Think about the 40,000 employees. Think about the shareholders. What do you want? Name it. A settlement? 10 million? 20. I can authorize a wire transfer right now. I don't want your money, Jonathan, Eric said, his voice dropping an octave. I have enough money. I can buy and sell you 10 times over before lunch. He leaned closer to the camera, his face filling the screen in Vane's Chicago office. I want blood. I want accountability. Not a press release 3 months from now. I want justice. Today. Right now. Vane wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Okay. Okay. What does that look like? Tell me. Eric turned his head. His gaze landed on Brenda Skinner. She was pressed into the corner of the galley, trembling violently. She knew, with a terrifying clarity, that her life was about to be dismantled. First, Eric pointed a finger at her. Her, Brenda Skinner. She is fired, effectively immediately. Brenda let out a sob. No, please, not just fired, Eric continued, ignoring her. Terminated for cause, gross misconduct, no severance package, no pension payout, no health benefits, and you will issue a public statement detailing exactly why she was terminated, so that when future employers Google her name, they know she is the woman who assaults children for wearing hoodies. On the screen, Vane didn't even hesitate. Done. Skinner, you're terminated effective this second. Hand over your badge. I gave you 20 years, Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical wail. She looked at the laptop as if it were a demon. I followed the rules. I was protecting the cabin. You cost me $400 million, Vane roared back, his voice distorting through the speakers. You nearly bankrupted this airline because you couldn't check a ticket. Get off my plane! Brenda collapsed. Her legs gave way, and she slid down the cabinetry to the floor, burying her face in her hands. The sobbing was raw and ugly, the sound of a world ending. Second, Eric turned his attention to Captain Miller. Miller stood straight, trying to maintain some shred of dignity, but his hands were shaking at his sides. The captain is responsible for his ship, Eric said. That is the oldest law of the sea and the sky. He let a bully run his cabin. He failed to protect a vulnerable passenger. He chose expediency over humanity. Eric looked at Miller. He retires today. Right now. He walks off this plane and never flies under the Vista banner again. He is grounded. Miller closed his eyes. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He had flown for 30 years. He had dreamed of aviation since he was a boy, and now, because he had trusted Brenda, it was over. Mr. Vane, Miller started, his voice weak. Hand over the keys, Greg, Vane said, his voice devoid of sympathy. I can't save you on this one. You're relieved of command. The co-pilot will secure the aircraft. Slowly, with trembling fingers, Captain Miller reached up to his shoulders. He unbuttoned his epaulets, the 4 stripes that signified his rank and his life's work. He pulled them off and placed them on the counter next to the laptop. They looked like dead birds. And third, Eric said. The anger in his voice receded, replaced by a steely determination. Vista Airways will create a permanent scholarship fund in my daughter's name. The Clara Jane Aviation Scholarship for underprivileged youth of color. $5 million, fully endowed, irrevocable trust. Vane nodded frantically on the screen. 5 million. Done. We can announce it tomorrow. And, Eric added, you will implement mandatory, in-person, third-party racial bias training for every single employee in your company, from the baggage handlers to the boardroom, and it will be overseen by a firm I choose. If I see one box-ticking exercise, one multiple-choice quiz, I pull the loan. Vane exhaled, a long, shaky breath. 5 million. The training, the firings. Is that it? If I do that, do we keep the liquidity? You keep the loan, Eric said. For now. He reached out toward the laptop. But Jonathan, if I ever hear of this happening to another child on your airline, I won't just pull the loan. I will buy the controlling interest in this company. I will fire the entire board, and I will sell the fleet for scrap metal. Understood, Vane whispered. It won't happen again. You have my word. Eric snapped the laptop shut. Click. The connection died. The courtroom was closed. The silence that returned to the cabin was different now. It wasn't fearful. It was the silence of a battlefield after the war is won. The power had been violently, totally stripped from the aggressors and returned to the victim. Brenda was a sobbing heap on the floor, no longer a senior purser, just a woman with no job and a ruined name. Captain Miller was staring at his hands, a former pilot. Eric turned his back on them. They were no longer worth his energy. He walked back to seat 1A, moving through the cabin that felt miles wide. He knelt down beside his daughter. Clara? He asked, his voice gentle, shedding the armor of the ruthless CEO and becoming a father again. It's over, baby. Are you ready to go? Clara looked up. Her eyes were red and swollen. She looked at her dad, then at the bandage on her wrist. Slowly she turned her head to look at Brenda, who was still crying on the floor. For the first time since the ordeal began, Clara spoke to the room. Her voice was quiet, raspy, but it carried a heart-breaking clarity that cut through the recycled air. I just wanted to listen to my music, she whispered. The simplicity of the sentence hung in the air. It was a devastating indictment. She wasn't a rebel. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a threat. She was just a girl who wanted to listen to a song and draw a picture. The passengers, Mr. Sterling in 2B, the woman in 1D, lowered their heads in shame. They had watched, they had judged, and they were wrong. I know, Eric said, brushing a curl of hair from her forehead. I know. Let's get out of here. Are we going to see Mom? Clara asked, a tiny glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. Yes, Eric said, helping her stand up. He picked up her backpack, the backpack that had started it all. But we aren't flying, Vista. He guided her toward the door, past the ruined career of Brenda Skinner, past the disgraced Captain Miller, and out into the jetbridge. The air in the terminal tasted different. It tasted like freedom. And somewhere, in the distance, a private jet engine was spooling up. The air inside the Gulfstream G650 was different. It didn't smell like stale coffee and recycled stress. It smelled of soft leather and expensive silence. 10 minutes after walking off the Vista Airways jet bridge, Clara was seated in a cream-colored recliner that was wider than her bed at home. The flight attendant on this plane, a woman named Sarah who had known Clara since she was a baby, didn't ask for a ticket. She simply brought a warm blanket, a cup of chamomile tea, and a fresh medical kit. As the private jet taxied toward the runway, bypassing the long line of commercial planes waiting for takeoff, Eric sat across from his daughter. He watched as the private doctor, who traveled with him, carefully cleaned and restitched the cut on her wrist. I'm sorry, Eric said. His voice was thick with an emotion he rarely showed. Guilt. I should have flown you private from the start. I wanted you to have a normal experience, to be independent. Clara looked up from her tea. Her eyes were still puffy, but the terror was fading, replaced by the bone-deep exhaustion of adrenaline withdrawal. It wasn't your fault, Dad, she said softly. You can't protect me from the whole world. But you came. I will always come, Eric vowed. As the Gulfstream roared into the sky, climbing aggressively toward the stratosphere, Clara looked out the window. Down below, the Vista Airways Dreamliner was still stuck at the gate, surrounded by police cars and news vans. It looked small, insignificant. 6 months later, The story didn't just make the news, it became the news. The video of Officer Higgins brutalizing Clara went viral within an hour of the incident. By the next morning, it had 50 million views. The hashtag #Shahashaw Boycott Vista was trending globally. But unlike most internet outrages that burn out in a week, this one had teeth, because Eric Jane had unlimited resources to keep it biting. The fate of the crew. Brenda Skinner, the woman who started it all with a sneer and a power trip, found out that the internet is forever. She was terminated for cause, which meant she lost her pension. But the karma hit harder than that. The statement Vista Airways released, detailing her racial profiling and aggression, made her unemployable. She became the face of intolerance. She lost her home 3 months later due to mounting legal fees from the civil lawsuit Eric filed against her personally. The last anyone heard, she was working the night shift at a warehouse, packing boxes in silence, forbidden from speaking to customers. Captain Greg Miller didn't fare much better. His forced retirement was stripped of honors. The pilot community is small. Word traveled fast that he had thrown a child under the bus to save his schedule. He spent his days in a quiet, lonely house, grounded forever. Officer Higgins faced the harshest reality check. The internal affairs investigation, fueled by the relentless pressure of Eric's legal team, didn't just fire him. The district attorney, sensing the political winds, indicted him for assault in the 2nd degree and official misconduct. He is currently awaiting trial, facing up to 7 years in prison. The badge he dropped on the counter was the last one he ever held. The healing. But the real story wasn't about the villains. It was about the survivors. Clara and Eric made it to Zurich that night. They walked into the sterile white room of the university hospital, and for the first time in months, Clara smiled. Her mother, frail but fighting, held her hand. The hand with the bandage. "You made it," her mum whispered. "I made it," Clara said. The treatment worked. Slowly but surely, her mother went into remission. Back in Atlanta, the Clara Jane Aviation Scholarship received its first class of applicants. 50 young students from underrepresented backgrounds were given full rides to flight school. Clara, despite her anxiety, stood at the podium during the inauguration ceremony. She didn't give a long speech. She simply cut the ribbon. One afternoon, a year after the incident, Eric found Clara in the garden. She was sketching on her iPad again. "What are you drawing?" he asked. Clara turned to the screen. It wasn't a dark, abstract sketch like before. It was a drawing of a girl looking out the window of a plane, soaring above the clouds. The girl in the drawing wasn't wearing handcuffs. She was wearing a pilot's headset. "I'm drawing the future," Clara said. Eric smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. The scars on her wrist had faded to faint white lines, a reminder not of the pain, but of the strength it took to survive it. They had tried to clip her wings. Instead, they had inadvertently taught her how to fly. This story is a brutal reminder that prejudice often hides behind a uniform. Brenda Skinner and Captain Miller thought they were dealing with a powerless thug. They judged a book by its cover, never realizing that the cover was a teenage girl just trying to see her sick mother, and the author was the man who owned their debt. It's a satisfying tale of hard karma. But let's not forget the reality. For every Clara who has a billionaire father to save her, there are thousands of others who don't. Clara's scars healed, but the trauma of being treated like a criminal in a space where you belong leaves a mark that money can't erase. It teaches us that authority without empathy isn't leadership. It's just bullying. And sometimes the bully picks the wrong fight. If this story made your blood boil, or if you cheered when Eric walked onto that plane, please hit the like button. It helps get this story out to more people. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been unfairly judged or profiled while traveling? Or have you ever witnessed an injustice and wished you could step in like Eric did? Share your story below. I read every single comment. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story about justice served cold. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.